Brontosaurus likely represents one of the world's most recognisable dinosaurs. Since its discovery in 1879, it has grasped the imaginations of generations. The thunder lizard, a behemoth even by dinosaurian standards. The huge, long-necked Brontosaurus holds a special place in many people's hearts. It has been used to advertise oil, starred in films, been recreated in toy form on countless occasions, and even appeared on stamps. It is truly a titan among dinosaurs. But whilst the titan has been accepted by the public with open arms, the sauropod people's champion has often received a more frosty reception in scientific spheres, with its very existence being subject to great debate and scrutiny. This is a story of dynamite and dinosaurs, subterfuge and stamps, a story of science in its most true form. This is the Resurrection of Brontosaurus. As with any good hero, the story of Brontosaurus starts in the midst of battle, the Bone Wars to be precise. The Bone Wars represent a period of competitive fossil hunting in early US paleontology. In the second half of the 1800s, Edward Drinker Cope and Neil Charles Marsh were two of America's most prominent paleontologists. But as the two gained recognition, a rivalry grew, with each believing that in order to become the authority on American dinosaurs, the other would have to fail. The feud grew with claims of incompetence, spying, and even sabotage being thrown from both sides in an attempt to discredit the other and their work. In both the scientific literature and the national press, slanderous accusations were levelled, drawing in paleontologists from across the United States. Scientists that were formerly happy to work away from public attention were forced to pick a side and respond to accusations of malpractice. Whilst the argument grew, both Marsh and Cope tried to continue their scientific work, but the competition influenced even that. Fueled by vanity and the same need for recognition that sparked the rivalry, each raced to name as many extinct species as possible. A leading paleontologist, they thought, would need a cast of leading dinosaurs. The principle of priority, established in 1842, essentially meant that if you managed to name a species first, that name stuck. It was designed to prevent confusion and disagreement, meaning each species would be associated with a single name. That way it would always be clear what animal scientists were referring to. For Cope and Marsh, however, this provided great incentive to name species quickly. If they got their names published first, those names would stick. Fueled by their animosity to one another, they hurried to publish their work. As a result, however, it was often error-strewn and lacking in reference to previous studies. And so, in this battle, arose Brontosaurus. Brontosaurus excelsus, to give it its full title, was first described by Marsh in 1879. It was represented by what was, at the time, the world's most complete sauropod fossil, the group of long-necked dinosaurs including Diplodocus and Brachiosaurus. Notably, however, it lacked a skull. Whilst a skull was unearthed nearby, it was dwarfed in scale by the skeleton discovered, and quickly dismissed as having come from another creature. Given the general use of heads in reconstructing dinosaurs, Marsh chose to base that of Brontosaurus on a fittingly large Camarasaurus skull, leading to the large-headed Brontosaurus many of us are familiar with today. Whilst this was subsequently found to be wrong, with the much smaller head initially discarded being a more likely fit, the greatest threat to the existence of Brontosaurus came not from its chimeric nature, but from one of Marsh's previous discoveries, Apatosaurus. Apatosaurus, meaning deceptive lizard, was described by Marsh in 1877, 2 years prior to that of Brontosaurus. As noted before, the principle of priority essentially meant that the first name given to an animal retained priority over any that may come later. By naming their species quickly, both Marsh and Cope hoped that their names would remain. In his rush to publish, however, Marsh had failed to notice that the exciting find that was Brontosaurus bore striking resemblance to that of Apatosaurus. When the paleontologist Elmer Riggs re-evaluated the two fossils in 1903, he spotted that the Apatosaurus first described closely resembled Brontosaurus, so much so that he proclaimed the Apatosaurus specimen to represent a juvenile form of Brontosaurus. To avoid any confusion, it was proposed one name should be given for the group, and following the internationally recognised naming rules, priority would be given to that used first, Apatosaurus. Not only had Brontosaurus been given the wrong head, Brontosaurus had effectively never existed. It had always been Apatosaurus, deceptive by name, deceptive by nature. The loss of Brontosaurus of course raises the question of how exactly one determines what a species is, something which is by no means unique to extinct animals. Modern species are determined using a host of evidence, from behavioural and morphological data to genetic and evolutionary. One of the most common methods is by following the biological species concept. It states that species constitute members of a population capable of at least potentially interbreeding to produce fertile offspring. An example of this is whilst horses and donkeys may be able to interbreed, the resultant offspring, mules, are not viable, being unable to breed, and the two are subsequently defined as separate species, horses and donkeys. With extinct animals, much of the information that we use to determine modern species is missing. In most cases we lack DNA, and behavioural data is similarly hard to come by when all you've got to look at is rocks. Similarly, the biological species concept becomes difficult to apply when your specimens have been dead for tens of millions of years, and, unsurprisingly, don't necessarily feel up for breeding. Given it is thought that more than 99% of species to have ever existed are extinct, this reflects a rather large issue when it comes to understanding life on Earth. As a result of this, we tend to focus on the clearest data we have available, that of morphology or form, and for that reason, follow the morphological species concept. The morphological species concept defines a species as a group of organisms united by a shared morphology. Effectively, if they look similar, they're the same species. How similar, of course, is the important bit, but it's difficult to give a definitive answer to. As we know, between modern species, defined by the biological species concept, individuals may appear very similar to one another, especially when only considering their skeletons, what generally remains when we look at extinct species and fossils. Conversely, individuals within species may display hugely varying morphologies. Most obviously, a difference is seen with sex and age. Male elephant seals, for example, can be 6 times heavier than their female counterparts, and some female anglerfish can be more than 10 times the length of males. It is therefore very difficult to determine what species fossils may belong to, and their definition should always be thought of as being subject to further findings. One example of this has been seen with the South Island giant moa and slender moa, extinct flightless birds found in New Zealand. Both are thought of as different species for years, with the giant moa being at least 280% heavier than the slender moa. This was until it was noted that the former were all female and the latter male. Instead of 2 species, they simply represented huge degrees of sexual dimorphism, like that of the elephant seals and some anglerfish, and were instead one species. Similarly, species vary in form with age. As was seen with Brontosaurus, it can be difficult determining how young and adult fossils may relate to one another. Even the great Tyrannosaurus rex has been suggested to represent an adult form of Nanotyrannus, a dinosaur that to some is considered a unique species and genus, and Triceratops has been proposed as a young Torosaurus. It should be noted that neither suggestion is in any way universally accepted. Both represent relatively contentious issues, but alongside the South Island giant moa, it goes to show the difficulty that comes with identifying species from fossil remains. Without all of the additional sources of information offered by living animals, the challenge of identifying species is only heightened. Subsequently, changes in classification are inevitable, and with every new fossil or analysis, there is the potential for our understanding to be altered. This is expressed never more clearly than with the resurrection of Brontosaurus. When Brontosaurus was assigned to the taxonomical scrap heap, it was done so as it was determined that in form it was so similar to that of Apatosaurus that it did not warrant an independent title, and with that, Brontosaurus had gone extinct for a second time, although it would stay that way for a lot less time than it had done so before. In 2015, Chop, Mateus and Benson took a selection of sauropod fossils, including that of Apatosaurus, and compared their morphologies to determine how they were related to one another. In their analysis, contrary to Riggs, they determined that the differences between Marsh's original Brontosaurus fossil and to those of Apatosaurus were distinct enough to warrant a new, or should that be old, name. Much like it had originally entered the world, Brontosaurus was back, and alongside this, the original Brontosaurus excelsus was joined by a further two species, Brontosaurus yanapin and Brontosaurus parvus. Rejected for more than 100 years, Brontosaurus had returned. But had it ever really gone away? Whilst it was returned to its position as rightful dinosaur in 2015, for more than 100 years Brontosaurus in the eyes of paleontologists didn't exist. Why, when Elmer Riggs deemed Brontosaurus indistinct from Apatosaurus, was it so clearly retained in public consciousness? What was thought of as a mere paleontological mishap managed to muscle into the big league. Brontosaurus continued to make appearances. Littlefoot of Land Before Time fame was of course a Brontosaurus, long after Riggs' claim, that is, before he eventually became an Apatosaurus, concerningly via Brachiosaurus however. And in 1989, even the US Postal Service chose to label their featured sauropod as Brontosaurus in their series of dinosaur stamps. Brontosaurus seemingly lived long after its death. This is not to say that no one cared of the mislabeling, with the New York Times claiming that the stamp decision had come at the annoyance of a rather ominously put paleontological lobby, who went as far as to accuse the Postal Service of promoting scientific illiteracy. This oddly ignores the greatest mistake of the stamp set, the inclusion of Pteranodon, unanimously not even a dinosaur. In response to the controversy regarding Brontosaurus, a spokesperson for the Postal Service argued that it was simply the best known name for the creature. And that could be it. Some have suggested that the evocative thunder lizard Brontosaurus simply better grasped public attention, and it's not difficult to see why. The thought of a huge lumbering beast with footsteps so loud they boom like thunder, paired with the ever so tangible reconstructions published by Marsh, simply resonated with a public receptive to the newly emerging ancient discoveries. So whilst the deceptive lizard Apatosaurus may retrospectively for some time have been more fitting, it simply wasn't as much fun. The retention of Brontosaurus of course shouldn't be viewed as the result of an ignorant public with an aversion to actual science. Some scientists, including Marsh himself and notably Henry Fairfield Osborn, president of the American Museum of Natural History, continued to use the outdated name. This meant that many museums retained their Brontosaurus labelling long after the name change. In addition to this, Riggs' claim in 1903 was associated with little fanfare. Subsequently, for a long time, there was little suggestion to those individuals not avidly following sauropod naming disagreements that anything had changed at all. Eventually, however, change did begin to come. Museums altered their labels, cartoon dinosaurs were reassigned, And even Dino, the Sinclair Oil mascot, was rebranded as an Apatosaurus. Change did come, just slowly and unevenly. The rate of this change perhaps is made even more frustrating with the 2015 finding. Just as soon as Brontosaurus had been displaced, was it thrust back into the limelight. For years, paleontologists had argued for Apatosaurus to be recognised. This was against the scientific illiteracy of Brontosaurus, as it was put, only for their efforts to apparently be made redundant. That is, however, only if you are interested in how you refer to everyone's favourite long-necked dinosaur. The story of Brontosaurus is far more than just a name. In paleontology, the switching of names is by no means uncommon. What is uncommon, however, is for such changes to occur with animals as well known as Brontosaurus. Brontosaurus or Apatosaurus, it matters little, but the fact that it was Brontosaurus subjected to such disagreements is significant. The fact that people care is significant. People paying attention matters. The story of Brontosaurus is not in its name, but in its journey. Uncertainty is often lacking when we discuss science. Science to some is seen as a world of certainty, of absolutes, and the tale of Brontosaurus is anything but. It is a story of rivals, of mistakes, of change, and ultimately, of uncertainty. The resurrection of Brontosaurus shows that science isn't just what we were taught in school. It is not regurgitated fact and objective truth, Brontosaurus or Apatosaurus. It is idiosyncratic, human, and importantly, changing. The resurrection of Brontosaurus is a story of continual discovery. It is a story of science at work, there for all to see. The beauty of science is not in its truths, but its ability to evaluate and accept new evidence and ideas. As Brontosaurus shows, the route to scientific discovery is not always smooth, but nevertheless, it is undoubtedly a worthy journey.